Pleasure to introduce Professor David Kyle Johnson, and he is a professor of philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a Catholic college, and for me and all the other recovering Catholics in the room, that is pretty substantial, a pretty substantial fact. Kyle is very well published and has a blog that you should follow. I don't follow blogs, and his is one that I frequent. He's well published in many journals and has two books out and another one coming out.
Contract signed, yeah, but it's
Contract signed, yes. And you will recognize him from some previous general meetings. He spoke once about the history of Christmas, once about natural evil and the simulation hypothesis. And my favorite, he explained to us the movie Inception and talked about Inception and philosophy. So I'm very proud to introduce David Kyle Johnson, talking about justifying beliefs in miracles.
All right.
If it gives you a problem, I can just sit here.
See if I've got.
You should. That little arrow on the side.
I am, and it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
working. Oh, there we go.
Good.
All right. Okay. So I ruined a joke.
If
That's
it
all right.
frustrates you at all, just holler and I'll jump.
Okay. All right. So for those of you who remember me, the book that's coming out is being published by American Humanist Press. It's my book on Christmas that I've been working on for 4 years or whatever. But the book is completely written, the contract is signed, and if there's not any hiccups, it should come out next year, which we have a plan for me to come back next year, talk about Santa Claus, all kinds of good stuff. So that'll be lots of fun. And I'll actually have books to sell next time, so that will be fun. But this time I'm going to talk about a paper that I have written, and I presented it at the Special Divine Conference, Special Divine Action Conference in Oxford this summer. Just like at King's, I was kind of the odd man out, one of the very few skeptics that were there. Most people were arguing for belief in miracles. And I presented my paper that the title is simply "Justified Belief in Miracles is Impossible." It's not possible to ever be justified in believing that a miracle has occurred. And so I've presented this, I've submitted it to a journal, and I forget the journal's title right off the top of my head, but it's a special edition, like a special religion and society, an atheism edition of this journal. I'm hoping it gets accepted there. A less inflammatory title of this talk would be "Why Belief in Miracles Requires Faith," right? Because faith is unjustified belief. Faith is belief without evidence, right, by definition. And so if I'm saying that belief in miracles is necessarily unjustified, all I'm saying is that it requires faith, which, unremarkably, or perhaps remarkably, that's what a lot of religious people say, is that whenever you have a miracle, you have a belief in miracle, you're believing by faith, right? So I'm really not saying anything that is that ridiculous, right? I'm actually saying what a lot of them actually admit, that belief in miracles requires faith, but that's not what they really think. They think they can actually give you arguments for things like Jesus' resurrection, for water turning into wine, any of Jesus' miracles, or Muslims might think that they can give you evidence that, Muhammad actually rode the horse Barak up to heaven or something like that. Like, they think they can actually give you evidence for the miracles that they claim to make the belief in them rational and not require faith, right? And so I'm actually contradicting that claim. A perhaps more humorous title for my paper would be, what's going on?
I had the same problem.
Can I just slap the thing and it will go? There we go. I don't know if you've ever heard this. I heard this numerous times at the conference, that the person who does not believe in miracles is like an ass who, even if one happened right in front of him, would not actually believe that it happened, right? And of course they used the word ass instead of donkey intentionally. So the idea is that someone like me, who would never think it's justified to believe in miracles, is as dumb as an ass, right? I'm actually defending the ass's position here. The ass is actually the epistemically justified one. You shouldn't believe that a miracle has occurred ever, even if one actually occurred right in front of your face. Even if you saw it with your own eyes, you are not justified in believing that the miracle actually occurred. All right, so Many cite miracles as evidence for God and the divine supernatural status of being, right? Of some beings, right? So Jesus' biblical miracles are said to be evidence of his divine status. And if you look through the scriptures, you see that all of the biblical writers are saying that Jesus proved that he was divine by doing this miracle. This miracle serves as evidence for his divine status. Aquinas makes the same argument in the Summa in question 43, article 4. Same argument. You see that his miracles prove his divine status. Most theists do not take the New Testament to be truthful myths, right? Some people have this kind of view of Scripture. It's not literally true. They're just nice stories. They're kind of like parables that give us nice moral lessons, and so the miracles don't really need to have happened for it to be meaningful. Well, if that's your view, then yeah, the miracles didn't occur and it doesn't matter, but most people do not take that view. I mean, you have experience, real-world experience out there. Most people are not highfalutin academic theologians who have justified their non-belief into actually being belief. Right? And so that's not what we're talking about here, right? People today use the occurrence of miracles as evidence for God's existence. So I've heard this numerous times. Oh, there we go. My son, Johnny, was born, he's 2 pounds in that picture. That's when he was born. So he was born 3 months early. A couple days in, he was not expected to survive. And so we were going through all that rigmarole. We thought that he was not going to survive. And he did, right? And here he is there today. Oh, isn't he cute? So this is the day that he was brought home. This was last year's first Christmas when he's finding out there is no Santa Claus. This was from back this summer, and this was this fall little picture session we had with him. And these are his 3 Halloween outfits that he had. So he's Superman, he's Scotty from the original Star Trek series, and this is actually yesterday we took him to a birthday party and he was Charlie Brown. So he's perfectly fine. So and doing great, and he's off oxygen and all that kind of stuff. If we could just get him to swallow real food, he'd be just normal. But of course I've heard many people try to profess to me that this is somehow evidence of God's existence, that this incident required divine intervention. The actual reverse is true. I could go on and on about this, right? But this story is actually evidence against God's existence because the reason he was being born premature was because of preeclampsia, which is evidence that if God did design the world and our reproductive systems, for some reason he made it such that women's bodies sometimes spontaneously just attack the placenta with antibodies and that as if it was an invading organism and kill the baby. Wow, that looks like a loving God that really designed the process well because he loves all little children, right? Only through the thanks of science is he actually alive today. If he was born just a couple decades before, he would not be alive. Right? So it's the thanks of science, not God, that I have a son named Johnny. So some people claim miracles are used to claim that dead popes are causing events when canonizing saints. People will use miracles as evidence that heaven is real. I'm sure we've all heard of this book, saw the horrible movie, whatever. I've got a blog on it if you're interested in it. The arguments are not good. Of the divine status of beings, there was a guy in India called Sai Baba who people claimed was divine because he would perform miracles. So the point, and last, Asbury New Testament scholar Greg Keener, I saw him in Oxford, argues that modern day miracles which occur serve as evidence for the historicity of biblical miracles. It was horrible. I felt like I was at a UFO conference listening to this guy talk. It was awful. So the point is that this is not some obscure thing that people don't really believe in. Belief in miracles and the occurrence of miracles and using it to justify religious belief is all over the place. It's very, very common. So the question of whether or not these kind of beliefs are actually justified is worth a look, right? So we're going to do a little miracle whip. My thesis is basically this, that miracles cannot be used as a way to justify supernatural belief, like belief in God, because justified belief in miracles is impossible. Even if you see a miracle for yourself, it's impossible. And that's contrary to Hume, right? Hume was just talking about, and we'll talk a little bit about Hume, but Hume's thesis, famous thesis, was that testimony cannot justify belief that a miracle has occurred and make it a just foundation for any system of religion. That was Hume's thesis. He's right. Testimony can't do it, but neither can seeing it with your own eyes. Nothing could justify belief that a miracle has occurred. I'm not arguing that miracles are impossible, but that justified belief in them is impossible, and consequently they can't be used to justify supernatural belief. But But interestingly, and this is kind of to upset, not really not upset, this is the best way to make the argument, but this upsets a lot of people on the other side. I'm going to make my argument by arguing against Hume. Now, usually that's what they do. They try to poke holes in Hume's argument and show that his argument was wrong. And I think they're right. Hume made some mistakes in his argument. Ironically, the mistakes that he made actually end up bolstering the case, in my case, against justified belief in miracles. So he made some little errors, but they actually work in his favor, and I'll show you why. So the first mistake he makes, I think, is he misunderstands exactly what a miracle is. We'll see this isn't a huge problem, but it will help us get to the bottom of something here. So the traditional kind of Humean definition of miracle is just a violation of natural law. What a miracle is a violation of natural law. It's when the natural laws that govern the universe have been violated, and that's what we would call a miracle. So like if water turned into wine or something, that would be, violation of natural law. I don't think that's right, and I actually heard this definition kicked around by a lot of people at the conference, and these are kind of people on the leading edge of miracle stuff, and so I think this is the right definition. And actually, Hume endorsed this definition, or at least this aspect of the definition. He just often ignores it. The right definition is just this: a miracle is just a supernatural intervention into the universe. God made some event happen. That's what a miracle is, regardless of whether it violates natural law or not. And it seems to me that this is the right definition, because if we thought that God, if we knew that God caused a particular event, then we would say that's a miracle. And it wouldn't matter whether or not that thing violated natural law, whether it was contrary to what we thought the laws of physics were or whatever, or whether it was consistent with them, and we just thought that God wanted to guarantee that thing that has a natural explanation may occur, or we would call that a miracle, right? So all we really want is, all we really think a miracle is divine intervention. That's what a miracle is, right? So the question then becomes, if it's divine intervention, the question then becomes, when are we justified in believing that supernatural divine intervention has occurred, right? One is justified in believing that supernatural intervention occurred, and thus that a miracle occurred, only if supernatural intervention is the best explanation for an event, right? So now we're getting at something, right? If we want to be justified in believing that a miracle has occurred, then we need to be justified in believing that God caused that event to occur. Well, when can we be justified in believing that? Only if God caused that event to occur is the best explanation for that event occurring. Right? Does that make sense? Is that simple enough? Right? If you think that X caused some event, well, then you have to be justified in believing that X is the best explanation for that event. If it's not, then you're not justified in believing that X caused it, right? So since we're now interested in what is the best explanation for the event, we must appeal to the criteria of adequacy, the method of abduction, the established way by which we determine what is the best explanation. Now, Ted Schick's not here. He teaches at Muhlenberg. He's got a book called How to Think About Weird Things. I'm sure you guys talked about it before. He lays out the criteria of abduction very, very nicely, better than anybody else in my opinion, and very quickly they go like this. When you're trying to figure out what the best explanation is for an event, you consider multiple hypotheses, multiple explanations for why that event occurred, and then you compare them to see which one is the most fruitful, simple, conservative, and has the widest scope, right? Fruitful just means doesn't make successful predictions, right? Simplicity means a hypothesis is simple if it doesn't invoke a bunch of extra entities or forces, right? So the less entities it has, the simpler it is. Conservative just means, it doesn't mean Republican, it just means that it coheres with what we already know is true, right? And then scope means it's explanatory, it explains the most, it doesn't raise more questions than it answers, and it explains, it could be, that kind of explanation could be used to explain even more diverse phenomena, well then it has wide scope. And what you do when you're trying to figure out what the best hypothesis is, you look at them all, and you figure out which one has most of these, right? So if you have 3 hypotheses, and this one has none, but this one has 1, but this one has all 4, well then clearly you prefer this hypothesis. Making sense? Good so far? All right. So, when comparing hypotheses, we should prefer the most adequate hypothesis. Certainly believing a less adequate hypothesis is not epistemically justified. We won't have to worry about fruitfulness with miracles because usually they can't be repeated, although there'll be a couple of exceptions we'll talk about in a minute. But these criteria, it's good to note that these criteria are irrelevant for ethics and aesthetics. You can't figure out what's morally right by figuring out the simplest, most wide-scoping explanation, right? You can't figure out what's most beautiful by appealing to simplicity or conservatism, right? But they are clearly relevant for miraculous explanations because they are causal explanations for events in the world, right? When we're dealing with ethics and aesthetics, we're not talking about causes. We're talking about miracles, we're talking about causes. We're talking about what caused this event in the world, right? That is clearly within the purview of abduction, right? That's its bread and butter, is to figure out what the cause of events is in the world. So we're not doing something inappropriate by appealing to it, right? So the problem is that supernatural intervention will not be the best explanation in the case of, for example, unlikely events. Right? Like winning the lottery, the miracle on ice, the so-called miracle on ice, or disease remission. If anybody knows what that picture's from, 5 points. Oh yeah, Star Trek. The fourth movie. Yes, Dr. McCoy gives her a pill that cures her kidney disease, and she's running around the hospital saying she was cured. But that would be like this. So this kind of stuff happens. The disease remission, does happen occasionally. But these are merely unlikely events. There are natural explanations for these events, right? Somebody eventually had to win the lottery, right? Tons of David and Goliath stories like this. These things do not violate natural law or anything. There are natural explanations for these things, right? And since those existing natural explanations exist, they're going to be more adequate. They're going to be simpler. They're not going to invoke extra entities. They're going to explain other phenomena. They're not going to conflict with what we already know. They're going to be more adequate explanations, right? So unlikely events do not justify one in believing that supernatural intervention has occurred, and neither do freak occurrences. If there's any Tarantino fans out there. Right? So the kid with the hand cannon was a lousy shot. That is a more adequate explanation for why Jules and Vince are still alive than God came down from heaven and stopped the motherfucking bullets. Right? This is the better explanation. It doesn't conflict with what we already know. It doesn't conflict with laws of science. It is a more adequate explanation. Is that making sense to everybody? Right? So unlikely occurrences, freak occurrences, those are not going to justify belief in supernatural intervention. Supernatural intervention will never be the best explanation for anything that has a natural explanation. The natural explanation will always be more adequate, right? However, supernatural intervention would seem to be the only explanation for an event that violates the natural laws. If we know, so here's a quote from my paper, if we know that an event that violates those laws has occurred, we know that the universe has not been left to its own devices, right? If something that breaks the natural laws has occurred, well, the universe can only cause things that are in conjunction with its laws. So if something has broken a natural law, well, then it must be that something from outside the universe caused that thing to happen. That's not only the best explanation, it's really the only explanation for something that violates natural law. So we can say that one is justified in believing that a miracle has occurred if and only if one is justified in believing that a natural law has been broken. So we see that Hume's mistake was not that detrimental. He was mistaken about what a miracle is. A miracle is just supernatural intervention, right? But what he did is he confused the definition of miracle with the conditions under which one would be justified in believing in a miracle, right? So miracle is just supernatural intervention, but when we're justified in believing in supernatural intervention is only when a natural law has been broken. Is that making sense? Saw a couple heads nod. No?
I'm sure you're going to come to it, but obviously the other explanation would be a misunderstanding of natural law.
We're getting there. We'll get there. We'll get there. So, but notice that if you were justified in believing a natural law has been violated, then you would be justified in believing in supernatural intervention, right? Question is then, right? So in fact, that's the next question, right? When can we be justified in believing that a natural law has been violated, right? Under what conditions can we be justified in believing that? Well, Hume said it's when a regularity established by experience has been violated. Right? So we all have these regular experiences. We experience the world in a regular way. We see all these regularities build up. If one of those regularities is violated, Hume says, then we can be justified in believing that a natural law has been violated. Well, I think that Hume was wrong about this as well. Now what Hume does, just a quick overview of his argument, Hume argues that testimony could never establish that a violation of an experienced regularity has occurred. Testimony can't justify one's belief in such a violation because experienced regularities have direct inductive evidence, whereas a tested violation can only have a single instance of indirect evidence, and a single instance of indirect evidence could never outweigh experience regularities on a regular basis. So testimony could never undo that, right? And he's probably right about some kinds of violations. So for example, very, very quick example here, my experience that dead people stay dead is pretty damn regular, right? I don't think testimony could ever justify me in believing that that regularity has been violated, right? So suppose that suppose a friend tells you that Princess Diana is now back from the dead. Your first inclination is go, no, bullshit, that didn't really happen. You read the Inquirer, right? That didn't really happen, right? But then suppose that you actually saw Princess Diana like on the nightly news with Brian Williams, and she's sitting next to in a live interview, and they're holding today's paper, and it's the doctor who declared her dead, right? And the doctor's sitting there, nope, she's back again, right? And I got DNA, blah, 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 blah. Like they could present all the evidence in the world. You're still not going to believe that she really rose from the dead, right? What's a more likely explanation?
She was never dead to begin with.
She was never dead to begin with, right? She faked her death, and he was in on it, or something like that, right? Like, grand conspiracy is still going to be more likely than she actually rose from the dead, right? Does that make any sense? I cannot imagine a situation in which hearing by testimony other people's kind of reports about this, that I'd ever be justified in believing that she actually rose from the dead. Conspiracy would always be a better explanation. Even if I saw it with myself, I don't think that I could be justified in believing that, right? And notice that if I can't be justified in believing that Diana rose after seeing her on TV with a doctor that declared her dead, I can't be justified in believing that Jesus rose because I heard it in a 2,000-year-old book written by non-eyewitnesses recounting oral tradition in a pre-scientific era, right? Like, there's no way that if I can't be justified in believing that Diana was raised in those kind of conditions, the Bible ain't going to cut it. Right? And so actually, this is really what Hume was going after. He was suggesting that the Bible does not justify belief in miracles. That's all he was going after. He's clearly right about that. Right? But we're going further. So, it seems that Hume was wrong about a second thing. Testimony can sometimes establish the violation of a natural law. I don't know why that's missing. I'm sure it's okay. So, but testimony can sometimes establish a violation of a natural law. Excuse me, not a natural law. Violation of an established regularity. It can sometimes justify a belief that established regularity has been broken. And there's this famous example. I found this 50-page paper on the history of this example called the Indian Prince example. So, the Indian Prince, bonus points?
Indiana Jones.
All right, good deal. Indiana Jones. All right. So the Indian Prince example goes like this. The prince is in India and has grown up there. And of course, India is a completely temperate climate. It never gets cold enough there for water to freeze, right? And so in his whole experience, all of his lifelong experience has been that water does not freeze. But then travelers start coming from more northern climates, like northern European climates, and they're like, oh, you won't believe it. It gets so cold in the winter from where I come from that the lakes will freeze and they'll get so hard that an elephant could walk across it and it wouldn't break. Indian Prince has never seen this happen, so he says, no, that's not really, I don't really believe that, right? But another traveler comes and tells the same story, and another, and another, and another. Eventually, enough testimony is going to build up to justify his belief that regularity, water doesn't ever get hard, that regularity is going to be broken. He's going to be justified in believing that regularity doesn't really hold. And that's contrary to his experienced regularity. Does that make sense? So it seems that under certain conditions, testimony can justify one's belief that an established regularity, and a regularity established by experience, has been violated. All right. Now, Hume had admitted this, that enough credible evidence could, build up in this way. But he argued that's not really miraculous. It's not a violation of experience regularity because it's not contrary to uniform experience of the course of nature in cases where all the circumstances are the same. In other words, he says, since the prince's experiences regarding water are not universal, then it doesn't really count as evidence against the experience. It doesn't count as evidence against his experience because he's never experienced what it's like in Northern Europe. And so since he's never experienced that, doesn't really count against his experience, right? The problem with this, of course, maybe you see it, is that no one's experience is universal. If you let the fact that my experience is universal mean that testimony could never overturn my experience, then nothing could ever overturn it. It's like I can't even be justified. Think of it this. Any seeming violation of my experience could be said to not really be a violation of experience because no one's experience is really universal, even like one's experience of death, right? So like Jesus' resurrection by this logic technically would not conflict with my experience because I've never experienced the conditions outside Jesus' tomb on Easter morning. I don't know what happens there. So the idea that Jesus rose from the dead is not contrary to my experience. Is that making some sense? Right? So it kind of gets him in a weird spot where like you end up not being able to doubt anything, because you could just say, oh, I didn't experience, my experience is not universal, so it doesn't contradict that. Right? So he's right, Hume's right that this example is not miraculous, and it doesn't count as a counterexample to his thesis, right? Because, I mean, like, lakes freezing isn't a miracle, right? So it's not an example, the Prince story is not an example of testimony justifying belief in a miracle. So it doesn't necessarily contradict his thesis, but it is an example of justified belief in a violation of an experienced regularity without justified belief in a violation of natural law. So what we end up with here is this. Hume was wrong about the conditions under which one is justified in believing that a violation of a natural law has occurred. So let me put it very simply, all right? Hume thought that if an experienced regularity was violated, that would justify you in believing that a natural law has been violated. He's wrong. Even the Prince was justified in believing that an established regularity was broken. It did not justify him in believing that a miracle has occurred. So Hume was wrong about the conditions under which one would be justified in believing that a natural law has occurred. But this actually works in his favor, because it turns out the reason he was wrong is because it's even more hard than he anticipated, more hard than he realized, to be justified in believing that a natural law has been violated. Violating an experienced regularity is not enough. There's got to be more. And the reason why, so a violation of a regularity established by our experience is not enough to justify the belief that the very laws of nature itself have been violated. Our experience simply is not that wide-scoping or reliable, right? So I think, for example, a lifelong experience of a holistic medicine practitioner or something like that, right? Where all his experience tells him that it works. And then he sees the evidence, like he sees these studies that show it doesn't actually work. Is he justified in believing that a miracle happened during all those studies? No. He realizes, I guess my experience led me astray, right? If he's a rational, holistic practitioner, right? So this is why conservatism is just one of the 4 criteria of adequacy. If we only let the fact that something coheres with what I think I know be the determining factor that regarding what the natural law is, then we can never develop in our understanding of what the natural law is or what's actually occurred, right? So testimony can at least sometimes establish that a non-conservative hypothesis has wider scope and is more fruitful and simple. Testimony can sometimes overturn what you've experienced. For example, maybe I can actually do this right now with testimony. Any of you who are parents probably have had the experience that giving your kids too much sugar makes them hyperactive, right? Seems to be an established regularity. We all seem to have all experienced this as parents. This is not the case. We've actually done studies on this. People have studied this in very controlled conditions where you have groups of kids. Some are given sugar, some are not, et cetera, and it turns out that neither one of them is any more hyperactive than the other. It's all kind of a placebo effect where we give them sugar and then we notice their hyperactivity, as it were, but they really would be more hyperactive with or without the sugar, right? So I should have now justified you in believing that an experienced regularity has been violated, right? And I did it purely through testimony, right? I did it by referring to scientific studies, but I did it through testimony, right? So testimony can sometimes do this, but notice that you're not justified in believing that a miracle has occurred, right? So the question then is this. To justifiably believe that a miracle has occurred, one must justifiably believe that a law of nature has been broken. But even establishing that experienced regularity has been violated is not enough to conclude that a natural law has been broken. So establishing that a miracle has occurred actually may be even harder than Hume thought. So this leads us to the question, so when would belief that a natural law has been violated be justified? If it can't be because it just justified a regular experience, the regular experience regularity, when can it be justified, right? To answer this, we need to make an important distinction. Consider the difference between a law of nature and a law of physics. And these are my own terms here, although I'm borrowing some from Mackey and a couple of others. Think of a law of nature as a law that actually governs the way the universe actually works. Mackey called these laws of working. We might call it a law of the universe. We believe that we live in a universe regulated by laws, right? That's what I mean by law of nature, one of those laws that actually governs the way the universe works. call a law of physics a human articulation of what we justifiably believe a law of nature is. Right? So we've done studies, we've considered experiments, and we've tried to discover what these laws are. And so laws of physics is our basically our best, won't say guess, right? Because they're not really guesses, they're very, very well established, right? But they're a human articulation of what we justifiably believe a law of nature is, right? So we might call it a scientific law or something like that. The laws in all the sciences are reducible to the laws of physics. That's what I mean by law of physics. Is that making sense? In those laws, we might also include things like laws of biology that laws of physics like supervene on. So it'd be like water doesn't turn into wine would be one of those laws of physics, that kind of stuff. Yes, sir?
Can you delineate a law of physics that is not a law of nature?
Well, if I could do that right now, if I could do that regarding a current law of physics, I wouldn't be working at King's College, right? Because when you overturn a law of physics and show that it's false, you're big. I mean, that's a really big thing, right? I can give you examples, however, of laws of physics that have ended up not being laws of nature, right? So, for example, Newton's laws and that's why I have them up here. Newton's laws of motion were once thought to be. They were once laws of physics, and they were thought to accurately describe laws of nature. And then Einstein ended up overturning them.
Newton's laws are not laws of physics now.
Right. They're now.
Yeah.
Right.
So you'd have to go historically.
Right. That's exactly right. Right. So I can't give you an example of any of our current laws of physics that aren't a law of nature, because again, that would mean I could get a big publication and go somewhere else. Right. But I can give you past examples of things that were laws of physics that are no longer, because we discovered that they aren't a law of nature. Right. And then that at least is enough to point out that even though I can identify one of them, it's at least possible that one of our current laws of physics doesn't actually track a law of nature.
So essentially
Right.
what you're saying is the difference between the two is defined by our ability or inability to accurately articulate what that law is.
Right. And it's just a definitional distinction at this point, right?
But we also know of laws of nature that were correct a couple of centuries ago that are no longer correct now. So it just sounds like it's semantics.
No. I mean, I don't know if maybe this is semantics, because this is just definitions I'm used to capture these concepts, because they're going to be important here in just a second, right? But I think given the way I've defined the terms, no law of nature has ever not been a law of nature and now is a law of nature. The law of nature, they're constant. They're the laws that have always governed the universe regardless of whether we discovered them.
Was there not a time when we thought everything was air, water, earth, and what's
That's what we thought. That's what we thought, but there never has been a time when it actually was the case that everything was air, water, fire, or wind.
Again, I understand what you're saying. But
Okay.
I think it's semantics.
It is semantics. That's not a bad thing. Semantics is not a bad thing, right? All I'm doing is defining these two terms so that we can use them in the upcoming slide.
I think it might be a better explanation to say laws of nature are laws of nature whether we know them or not. Whether they are,
That's right.
that we actually accurately describe them or not, they are laws of nature.
Right.
The laws of physics are, this is what we think is our current best explanation of these laws, and they change.
Right. Right. Now I saw another hand over here. Did it?
Okay, work equals force times distance. That's a physics law.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do isometrics, you're not doing work.
Oh, it sounds like you're just equivocating on work there.
It's a matter of definition, but I'm giving you an example of where the definition itself can be misleading.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to avoid that problem by being really clear about my definition. If I just started throwing out laws of nature, laws of physics, we might get confused. I want you to know what I mean here, right? So we could avoid that kind of problem by saying, by the word work, I mean this, and by the word effort, I mean this, or something like that, right? And so you don't work in this way, but you are putting forth effort. You could, you avoid that kind of confusion by delineating your terms. And that's what I'm trying to do here, is avoid a confusion just by semantically delineating two terms. Right, trying to avoid equivocation, that's exactly right. Okay, so when we're considering the big question, when would belief that a natural law has been violated be justified, we realize that the laws of physics are our best estimation of what the laws of nature are, derived not merely from experience, but from careful, repeated, controlled experiments, mathematics, and scientific adequacy. But, as history shows us, they can be wrong, right? And so our current laws of physics might be wrong, right? We're justified in believing them, but they might be wrong. So we are justified in believing that a natural law has been violated when we can do two things. When we are justified in believing that a law of physics, X, has been broken, and we're also justified in believing that law of physics X accurately describes a law of nature. Then we would know that a natural law has been broken. Is that making sense? So we know that a law of physics has been broken. We know that law of physics tracks a law of nature. So we know that law of nature has been broken. That we have to do those two things to be justified in believing that a natural law has been broken, and in turn that supernatural intervention has occurred and a miracle has occurred. Is that making sense? So now, so we have our two conditions. Can these conditions be met? Can we do both of these things? Well, it's almost impossible to meet the first criteria. To show that a law of physics has been broken, that is not easy. And certainly, the testimony of an eyewitness is not going to cut it. Right? The hypothesis that the testifier is lying, mistaken, or ignorant will always be a better explanation. It will always be simpler, more wide-scoping, and more conservative than the hypothesis that a law of physics has been broken. Right? Even if you have multiple testimonies of eyewitness, collusion or mass delusion is still going to be more likely in that event. Is that making sense? Simply put, the eyewitness reports, or even collective eyewitness reports, can't overturn scientific consensus. Right? It's just not going to be enough. Right? It might be able to overturn my own personal experience. So if enough people see something, then I might be able to overturn an experience regularity, but it can't overturn scientific consensus. Right? So testimony's not going to do it. But it's also the case that direct observation is not going to do it. Many hypotheses are more likely. Oh, shoot, and I forgot, I do have one animation here and it's not working. I don't see Diane here. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this. I wonder if I can get it to work. I don't want to mess with it. So this is a very famous optical illusion where you see these two things, they're obviously the same color. If you fill this out into a checkerboard and put a little cylinder with a shadow, you would swear they are completely different colors. One's black and one's white. And they're not. It's a really cool, when the little animation actually just slowly fills it in, and you're just like, yeah, they're the same color. They're the different color. And then it goes back and they're the same color, and they don't change at all. Right? Our perceptions can lead us astray. Our experience is not that reliable. Right? So even my direct observation of something is not going to be able to overturn scientific consensus. The limits and powers of my senses have led me astray will be more likely. I am ignorant. So this is actually what you remember. I think you mentioned a while ago that I can't find a natural explanation. Actually, maybe what you mentioned a while ago is a little bit. But so, like, we're actually in this condition all the time. If we go to a magician show, I've seen Penn and Teller live. They do stuff all the time. I have no idea how they're pulling it off. I have no natural explanation for how they can do what they do. But I do not conclude from that they have magic powers, right? I conclude from that I'm not that bright, right? There's a natural explanation that I simply can't detect, right? That I am ignorant is a much more likely explanation than the laws of physics have been broken, right? Like, that's a much bigger hypothesis. I'm just not as smart as I think I am. That's much more likely, right? So not even my senses can overturn scientific consensus, right? But it can be done. You can overturn a law of physics. You can show that a law of physics has been broken. That can be done. Einstein and the eclipse proved that Newton's laws were wrong, right? So, roughly put, Newton predicted that light would not bend around stars. Einstein did. Einstein and Newton were incompatible in this way. We were able to do the observation during an eclipse, see light from a distant star bending around it to the degree that Einstein predicted. And we realized that what we thought was what was a law of physics, Newton's laws, had been broken, right? So it can be done. But notice that even if you do meet that first criteria in that extremely difficult set of circumstances to do, right, doing so makes it impossible to meet the second criteria, right? So showing that a law of physics has been broken ain't easy, but once you do it, you make it impossible to meet the second criteria, which is justifying believing that law of physics actually is a law of nature. And I think that's what you were getting at, right? That's what's impossible now. So you have these two criteria. You got to know that a law of physics has been broken, and that law of physics is a law of nature. It's really hard to do the first thing, but once you do the first thing, you automatically make it impossible to do the second. You cannot justifiably believe that law of physics actually tracks a law of nature, right? So, an easy example. So here's another example of where we came close, but didn't quite reject the law of physics. One of Einstein's law is that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, right? Well, a couple years ago, with the opera particle detector, there were some very smart scientists trying to measure the speed of neutrinos. And their measurements indicated that the neutrinos were traveling faster than the speed of light. Now, this was not a very conservative conclusion. It conflicted Einstein's laws, and Einstein's very, very well established. So they didn't just say, oh, hey, we've overturned Einstein. No, they were good scientists. They're like, whoa, something might be wrong with our experiment. Let's do it again. They kept getting the same results. Let's take the experiment to the scientific community. So they went to a big conference and said, all right, here we go. Here's the experiment. Here's how we did it. Our experiment shows that neutrinos are traveling faster than the speed of light. We know that doesn't sound right. We're not saying that they are. We're putting it to you to replicate our experiment, to try to study it, figure out if and what we did wrong. Let's see if we're right about this, right? Or let's see if the experiment is showing the right things, right? And so we did. I didn't, but the scientific community did, right? Scientific community went, they studied what was going on, and eventually they found out what was wrong. Roughly put, there was an optical sensor that wasn't plugged in all the way, right? So, and that may seem silly, but if you consider the apparatus that they were using and all that, that was a very easy thing to overlook, right? Even when you're looking for something wrong, but put it to enough people, they found it, right? But suppose that's not what happened. Suppose that everyone tried to replicate their experiments, and they got exactly the same results. The entire scientific community went over all the experiments and they couldn't find anything wrong. Replication, no mistakes. We would have come to justifiably believe that a law of physics, Einstein's law that nothing travels faster than the speed of light, had been broken. We would be justified in believing that. But in the instant that we were justified in believing that, we would have realized, oh, Einstein was wrong. That's not a law of nature. And so we would not have been justified in believing that that law of physics tracks the law of nature. Is that making sense? So it has to be the case that in order to be justified in believing that a miracle has occurred, you've got to be able to be justified in divine in supernatural intervention. And to believe that, you've got to be justified in believing that a law of nature has been broken. But to believe a law of nature has been broken, you've got to think that a law of physics has been broken, and that law of physics is a law of nature. You can't do both. It's really hard to do this one, but even when you accomplish it, it automatically makes it impossible to do this. Making sense? And if somehow you were justified in doing this, then you would know that this one had not been broken. There's no way to do both at the same time. And so I feel like in this paper, I'm not even arguing that justified belief in miracles is impossible. I'm explaining why, given epistemic facts, simply given how justified belief works, it's not possible to be justified in believing in a miracle. It's just these are the conditions that can't be met. It's as simple as that. So, it's impossible to, this is all repeat. So all in all, it's not easy to establish that A, law of physics has been broken, but even if we do, it makes it impossible to do B, right? So let me look at the time here. I think I can do this fairly quickly. Obviously, a lot of people don't like this, right? You can see why I've upset a few people. So I've had a number of objections lobbied at me. So let's consider a few objections to my and then we'll ask some questions here. So very quickly, since I'm saying that it's impossible to justify a belief in a miracle, people have tried to propose situations and when it would be justified, right? So suppose that there's a crying statue and I can't explain why this statue is crying. So unlike the one that was in, I forget where it was. There was one somewhere where people were like, it's crying, it's crying, it's crying, and it turned out that it was just butted up against a wall with a leaking sewer pipe. Right, and that's the sewer water was getting on it, and that's all that was going on. Right, but suppose that there's no such explanation. I even bring in like Penn and Teller and the Amazing Randy. They can't figure out an explanation. Are we justified in believing it's a miracle then? No. I can be fooled. They could be fooled. Hell, they could be in on it. Right? I mean, they could be, I don't know, maybe somebody's holding Randy's, child or something hostage and forcing him to say that he can't find an explanation. I mean, there's all kinds of different explanations, right? So I wouldn't be justified then. Let's say you see a car crash and someone's dismembered body and then the limbs like flop up and reattach themselves. The guy stands up, says hello, and walks away. Right? Justified in believing in a miracle then? No. Again, I'm hallucinating is a better explanation. I've seen similar magic tricks to this, so maybe someone's pulling a trick on me. Even unknown alien technology would be a better explanation than divine intervention. This is my favorite. Somebody proposed this to me at the conference. Suppose someone says while looking in their telescope that they found a collection of different stars that in one day, which would have been 1 million years ago, became arranged such that they spell out, so you see this written in the stars, give it up, Kyle, belief in miracles can be justified, here's your proof, God. Right? And that's spelled out in the stars, right? Would I be justified in believing then? I have to say I'd be flattered, right, to find a message to me in the stars, but this still would not confer epistemic justification. Trickery, a rigged telescope would be more likely. Even if I built my own telescope in secret so that nobody was pulling a trick on me, aliens pulling a trick on me would still be a better explanation, a simpler, more conservative, more parsimonious explanation than divine intervention. Those would still be better, right? Be pretty cool, but still wouldn't be justified. Now, even since I wouldn't believe, I don't think we're justified in believing in a miracle, even in that extreme circumstance, some people have objected to my position by saying it's non-falsifiable. Right? It means nothing could convince you. God could come in front of you and do tricks himself, everything that you demand, and you'd still say it's more likely that he's an alien. Right? So yes, I would say that because it is more likely that he's an alien. That is just the epistemic fact, right? So they say, claim it, but that makes your position unfalsifiable, that makes it irrational. Well, not really. It is unfalsifiable, but that doesn't make it irrational. Technically, as Quine pointed out, everything's non-falsifiable, so it doesn't even make it special. And counterexample, if you look at the history of science, counter evidence can be justifiably ignored if the theory itself that the evidence is against is firmly established enough. But here's the thing, one of the most important things. I'm not making excuses or reversing evidence. So usually what makes, when a hypothesis is unfalsifiable, the reason that it's irrational is because it's unfalsifiable for a certain kind of reason. So, for example, I'm not making excuses, right? I'm not doing what the creationist does when they say that the earth is only 6,000 years old. Here's a 10,000-year-old tree. Satan put that tree there to make it look like the earth is older than it actually is, right? I'm not making up excuses to save my hypothesis, right? I'm comparing available hypotheses based on criteria of adequacy, which is already established, right? I'm not doing what makes conspiracy theories unfalsifiable, right? Conspiracy theories are unfalsifiable because no matter what evidence you present, that evidence could always be planted by the conspirators. Right? So you have whatever your favorite conspiracy is, right? The Illuminati, right? And you say, no, clearly, here's the evidence that the Illuminati are not real. Yeah, that's what they want you to think. The Illuminati planted that evidence to throw you off the track, right? I'm not doing any of that. That's usually when hypotheses being unfalsifiable mean that it's irrational. I'm not doing that. I'm just merely observing that, and I'm not. Put it this way, these points go together. I'm not adopting a methodology that closed-mindedly ignores any evidence, no matter how convincing, that a miracle has occurred. I'm not adopting a methodology. I'm pointing out that the methodology that we all already use, the criteria of adequacy, just entails that when you're looking at this kind of stuff, it just naturally falls out. The natural conclusion is that the belief is not justified. The miraculous belief is not justified. I'm not adopting a modern methodology at all. I'm just explaining why the established methodology has this result. Right? So and that's what I say here. All right. So we could actually make an analogy like this. If you see a UFO, unidentified flying object, so you see, in other words, if you see something that you can't explain in the sky, that's an alien craft will never be the best explanation. And that's an unfalsifiable position, but that's just a matter of fact, right? There will always be better explanations for what you're seeing in the sky than that's an alien craft. Right? No matter what, it's a satellite, it could be a new airplane you've never seen before, whatever it is, there will always be a better explanation, or the limits of your experience will always be a better explanation than that. Is that making sense? Right? Now, there's one exception to that. That's an alien craft could be the best explanation for something if we lived in a Star Trek universe, right? Like, if I lived in the 24th century and the existence of aliens and the fact that they visit our planet is already a well-established fact, well then, yeah, I could say, I'm not sure what that is, but it's probably an alien craft, right? Then I would be justified, right? If the existence of UFOs and the fact they visit is already justified, well then I could, right? I mean, the same way that, like, a caveman would never be justified in believing, like, looking at something in the sky and go, oh, that's a plane, right? Yeah. Caveman would never be justified in believing that, right? I am. If I see something in the sky, I don't know what it is, that's probably a plane. I can be justified, because the existence of a plane is already...
A spaceship crashed in California last week.
Oh, did it?
Did.
Again? Like, I'm sure there's been other reports of spaceships crashing in California.
No, it's a spaceship.
No, it's a real one.
Yeah, first plane.
Oh, that one. Right. Alien craft. Alien craft, not spaceship. Alien craft. Right. So, in the same way, we could say, if knowledge of God and the fact that he intervenes in the world occasionally was already established and known, well then if you see something that you couldn't explain, you say, oh, that's probably God did that, right? Is that making sense? Like if that was already established, right? Okay, then that would be. That this does not count as, this is not an argument against my thesis, not a successful argument against my thesis, for two reasons. One, that counts only if knowledge of God can be justified, and I don't think it can be justified either. And basically for the same reasons, right? I mean, for one, deductive arguments for God don't work. Inductive arguments for God don't work. For the same reason that God did it, it's never going to be a better explanation for an event you see. God did it, it's not going to be the best explanation for the existence of the universe either. Right? So those kind of arguments don't work. Ted Schick's got a, whoops, I'm so sorry. I'm not using it anyway. Ted Schick's got a great paper on this, why God did it will never be the best explanation for anything. It's not properly basic. I could go on and on and on. These arguments don't work. So knowledge of God can't be established, so this is a moot point anyway. But even if it could, my main point was that belief in miracles cannot be used to justify religious belief. Right? That's how most people use them. See, Jesus' miracles prove he was God. Your son Johnny proves that God exists. Right? Even if this point is valid, it doesn't matter because it just has things backwards. You have to justify the religious belief first in order to then be able to believe in the miracles. But by then, the miracles don't tell you anything. Right? They don't prove anything because you've already proved what you're trying to prove with them. Is that making sense? So even if this works, it's backwards. Right? So, fourth, I'm applying the wrong criteria because I'm applying abduction to things that are miracles, and miracles are religious, and so they can't be bothered with science. This is just false, right? If religion was only as Gould suggested about ethics and meaning, well then yeah, you can't do abduction with ethics and meaning. That's irrelevant, right? But it's not. When someone says, I believe in Jesus and you should do what he tells you because he rose from the dead. He rose from the dead is not a claim about ethics or meaning. It is a claim about something that happened in the world. And so I can apply the criteria of adequacy when you're saying that something happened in the world. I can say, really, is divine intervention the best explanation? Right? So I'm not misapplying a criteria. I'm not applying the wrong criteria. The mere fact that something's religion does not disqualify it from scientific examination. Prayer cured my cancer is a religious claim that can be falsified by scientific evidence. Right? You can actually look and see if your cancer's still there. And lastly, abduction can lead you astray. So it is the case that if a miracle actually happened in front of my face, I wouldn't be justified in believing it. And I could be wrong. Maybe a miracle really did happen in front of my face. It can lead you astray. So therefore you should never use it? No. No. Right? Of course abduction can lead you astray. It's a type of inductive logic, and inductive logic does not guarantee its conclusion. It gives us our best justified estimate, as it were. But it can be wrong. But despite that, it's still our best method for discovering truth. So it's still the conclusion that should be justified, even if it's not true. Right? This is not an endorsement of scientism. I'm not saying abduction should be used for everything. Like I said, it's irrelevant for ethics and meaning and that kind of stuff. Only if a more reliable method of reasoning that more reliably got us to the truth were devised should we even abandon abduction. Right? But it's likely that any such method would suggest divine intervention as the best explanation, because a method that justified belief in divine intervention would also justify belief in ghosts and psychic and dowsing and chi and a host of other non-existent supernatural paranormal phenomena, and so it wouldn't be reliable. Right? So abduction is our best method for discovering the truth about the world. Miraculous claims are claims about the way the world is, and so when we look at the criteria of abduction, we simply realize that it will never lend itself to suggesting that supernatural intervention is the best explanation, and thus belief in miracles is never justified. There we go.